Welcome to See Crime Stories, true stories of the missing and the pursuit of answers. 5 seconds is all you need to know something's wrong. A reliable teller doesn't show, the phone stays dark, and routine collapses into paperwork and tape. Friday, September 10, 1999, Albuquerque, New Mexico. The bank unlocks at 8:30 a.m. One teller, 36-year-old Girly Chew, isn't on the line. No call. No text. A supervisor documents the absence and requests a welfare check. Patrol drives to a mid-level apartment complex not far from the branch. The property manager meets officers. Lawful entry is recorded on the run sheet. The first impression is order, bed made, counters clear, nothing obviously ransacked. The second impression is chemical, a sharp cleaner smell that doesn't fit the hour. Officers pause, step back, and lock down the scene. Detectives arrive with a crime scene tech. Standard sequence, wide photographs before movement, then slow, square-by-square passes. On the bathroom tile, tiny irregular sheens catch light at low angle. A faint ridge under the vanity suggests contact spatter, not a spill. Swabs are labeled, sealed, and logged. In the living room, a small fold of carpet near the couch shows discoloration inconsistent with routine wear. That, too, is cut, bagged, and signed across the tape. The chain of custody begins here: names, times, gloves, seals, because later, only what's documented will matter. Neighbors are canvassed. No one reports shouting, forced entry, or a midnight argument. 2 note the odor of bleach in the morning hallway. Outside, Girly's car sits in its usual spot, no glass, no pry marks. The door lock shows no tool damage. If someone entered, they used a key or were let in. Detectives mark high-touch points, door lever, light switches, faucet handles, for latent prints and trace. A luminol plan is added for nightfall to visualize blood that cleaning may have diluted. This is not a missing by choice file, it is a probable violent scene absent a body. At the bank, investigators collect the basics: schedule, emergency contacts, last shift, last known plans. Managers agree to pull any exterior CCTV that might catch her arrival patterns or who followed her on prior days. Subpoenas go out for call detail records and account activity to bracket the last confirmed communications. The logic is mechanical, established when Girly's routine stops, who had proximity, and which story fragments are supported by timestamps rather than memory. In towns like Albuquerque, cases don't advance on hunches, they move when chemistry and clocks agree. The early data aligns cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. By night, the apartment is dark, windows covered, lights off for the luminol pass. Blue-white reactions bloom along baseboards and at the vanity edge. Patterns are photographed, measured, and mapped. Volume isn't the point, pattern is. The sequence suggests contact with blood and subsequent cleanup. No large pool, no drag path to the door, no body. Whatever happened here didn't end here. The search widened fast. South of Albuquerque, just past open lots where people dump old lumber and torn furniture, patrol flagged an object that didn't match the landscape, a weathered tarpaulin bunched into itself, bound with duct tape. It wasn't announced over the radio as a break. It was documented, photographed, and moved with care. That discipline matters. In cases like this, answers live or die in the way evidence is handled. The tarp came to the lab sealed. Technicians didn't guess at what was inside. They opened it on clean paper under a hood, gloved and double-masked. 1 person logging, 1 person lifting. Clothing first, women's garments consistent with the missing teller's size and style, tagged separately. The tape was treated like its own scene. Adhesive sides can hold more than most people think: skin cells, hair, fibers, dust. The team pressed the tape against glass to keep the stickiness intact, then cut small sections for microscopy and later DNA work. Presumptive tests on staining were straightforward, positive for blood. No dramatics, no hypotheticals, just a color shift that means go deeper. Samples moved to confirmatory testing. Portions of fabric were clipped and reserved for any future defense examination. That's not just procedure, it's fairness. If this case ever saw a jury, both sides would need to touch the same evidence and reach their own conclusions. Under the scope, the tape held a surprise: hair. Not a clump, just a few strands curled into the seam of the adhesive. Root material on at least one. That matters because a root can carry nuclear DNA. The hair was teased free with sterile forceps and set aside in a labeled bindle. Another technician mapped textile fibers and grit. Location tells a story. The ground off State Highway 47 collects a certain kind of sand and plant matter. That profile doesn't convict anyone, but it narrows when compared to shoes, car mats, or garage floors later collected by warrant. Detectives didn't build a theory around the tarp, they built a timeline around it. When was it likely placed? How weathered were the outer folds compared to the inner layers? Was the binding a single continuous strip or several torn pieces? They photographed tear patterns because torn duct tape can sometimes be matched end to end. Think of it like a paper puzzle with jagged edges that only fit one way. Little things close big cases. Back in the city, the team avoided public overreach. The department told reporters they were analyzing items found outside the metro. No suspect names. No speculation. It's a basic rule: you protect the integrity of a nobody investigation by letting the lab speak first. Families want certainty, the community wants speed. But rushing creates mistakes that defense attorneys can exploit a year later. In towns like this, justice isn't a headline, it's a record that holds up when challenged. The DNA workflow in 1999 didn't match the speed you see today. It took patience, extraction, quantitation, amplification, then comparison against known profiles or elimination samples. Detectives quietly collected voluntary swabs from people in the missing woman's circle, co-workers to exclude, close contacts to document, anyone with potential access to her home or belongings. Each swab carried a consent form or a court order. No shortcuts, no gray zones. If a profile emerged from that taped hair, it had to be admissible. Logistically, the rural find changed the search posture. Teams walked drainage paths and fence lines within a defined radius measured from the tarp location, spacing volunteers and deputies so their sweeps overlapped. They were not looking for a body alone, they were looking for transfer: a dropped earring back, a button, a paper scrap, a ticket stub. Nothing obvious surfaced, and that gap became its own data point. If the tarp was a staging tool, the disposal site might lie elsewhere. If it was the end point, scavengers and time could explain the silence. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. One quiet, essential step happened in parallel: clothing identification. Friends and coworkers reviewed brand, size, and any unique features: embroidery, mending, a missing button noted in casual conversation a week earlier. You don't ask loved ones to shoulder more than they must, but in a nobody case you lean on people who can tell a sweater from a near-identical sweater. Their confirmations, recorded on the same day the lab logged the items, gave the tarp more weight than a random dump. It tied the rural site back to the woman who never clocked in. There's a human truth that doesn't leave the paperwork: missing means waiting. It's the space between not knowing and the moment you can finally name what happened. The investigation stayed disciplined because real closure, legal and personal, depends on it. We tell these stories to remember that careful work is a form of respect. The next move wasn't dramatic, it was clinical. Detectives built a working day from the outside in: who saw Girly Chew Hassenkoft when she was last reliably accounted for, and exactly where the timeline went dark. That meant phones, bank schedules, and anything with a timestamp that didn't care about opinions. Call detail records came back first. In 1999, it was mostly landline and early cell traffic, numbers dialed, durations, and tower hits that only gave a general sector. Investigators plotted the log against her known routine. Outgoing calls lined up with normal chores: a brief check-in earlier in the week, a call about a work schedule, a short call to a friend that ended on time. Nothing after the evening before she failed to report. No late-night chatter, no sudden flurry. Silence wasn't proof of harm, but in missing person work it's a signpost. People with jobs and steady lives don't vanish from their own call histories without a cause. Bank documentation confirmed she was expected on the morning she missed. Supervisors produced her recent time cards and a simple, powerful fact: she was punctual. Detectives pulled any nearby security footage that still existed: front lots, hallways, storefronts that faced the street she used. Angles were limited and tape ran over itself, like most systems in the late 90s, but you gather what you can while it still exists. A neighboring business had a camera pointed toward a cross street where employees parked. The picture quality was poor. Even so, timestamps gave a frame for when her usual parking spot was occupied and when it wasn't. The car location matched what patrol had observed during the welfare check. The vehicle hadn't moved overnight. That narrowed the window. Friends and coworkers gave short, consistent statements. She kept a pattern. She had voiced concerns about safety. She was taking steps to protect herself. Detectives didn't file those as drama. They filed them as motive context and then went back to the records that could be tested. You don't build a nobody case on feelings. You build it on things that can be measured, compared, and defended later in court. At the lab, the evidence from the rural site moved forward. Clothing was already logged. The duct tape sections yielded fibers and hair. One strand contained root material suitable for nuclear DNA analysis. Given the era, nobody promised a quick turnaround. The process was deliberate: extract, quantify, amplify. Detectives, meanwhile, mapped a consent and warrant plan. You exclude people who touched the victim's life in ordinary ways, and you gather comparison samples from those with potential access to her home or belongings. Paperwork mattered. Every buccal swab had a signature, a date, a time, and a reason it existed. While DNA was in motion, a second digital lane opened: account activity. Investigators checked whether her bank cards, ATM access, or employer-related systems registered anything after the last verified timeline point. Nothing. No withdrawals, no late-night gas receipt, no strange access to her workplace credentials. It sounds small, but a lack of financial noise is evidence. In towns like this, normal life leaves tracks. When those tracks stop, investigators ask why, where, and who benefits. Back at the apartment, the luminol mapping from the prior night was converted into measurements and photographs that would travel to the courtroom if needed. The team didn't republish the scene or rescan it for spectacle. They documented, sealed, and moved on. A separate unit reviewed incoming tips for anything that intersected with the new map of her last day: a car seen idling, a door propped, a bag carried at an odd hour. Most tips were noise. A few gave direction for follow-ups: cross streets to drive, stores to call about tapes they might still have in the back office. There was a quiet, human step that doesn't read big in headlines but matters in the long term. Detectives met with two people who knew Girly well and walked them through next steps without false promises. When families and close friends understand why investigators need time for lab work and why they won't accuse anyone on camera, they're more likely to share small details that pay off later: a spare key that once changed hands, a routine phone time, a habit of locking the deadbolt every time. Those facts don't solve cases by themselves, but they steady the work. Respect is a tool too. The day ended with a board that made sense. The last confirmed routine was set. Phone activity stopped in a narrow window. The car didn't move. A rural site produced clothing and recoverable trace. DNA was pending. The plan for tomorrow was practical: recanvass along the commute path during the same hours she would have driven it, check dumpsters and construction bins inside a defined radius, follow up on any location that sold the exact duct tape brand recovered, and keep the lab queue clear. The data aligned in a way that didn't scream conspiracy. It traced ordinary lines that suddenly broke. Sometimes the clearest maps are the ones with a hard stop. As a narrator, I'll say this plainly for anyone watching who has lived through the uncertainty of a missing loved one: the measured pace isn't indifference. It's how you make a case survive scrutiny. In nobody homicides, cases die when shortcuts get exposed. Cases live when every step can be shown, defended, and repeated by another lab if a judge orders it. Lab results came back in stages, not with a headline but with a notation: the hair recovered from the duct tape had a viable root. Nuclear DNA could be profiled. When the comparison work was finished, the report did what good evidence does: it narrowed the field. The profile matched a woman who had intersected the victim's life in the weeks before the disappearance. The name isn't the point yet. The linkage is. A non-relative's DNA on tape wrapped around a tarp holding Girly Chew Hassenkoff's clothing is not background noise, it is proximity that needs explaining. Detectives moved from chemistry to cash registers. The tape itself wasn't exotic, but brand and torn edge patterns gave them enough to start asking retailers for transaction logs around the relevant dates. Late 1990s point-of-sale systems weren't built for speed, yet big-box managers could still pull SKU histories and receipt ranges if given tight windows. Investigators cross-referenced those windows with known alibis and vehicle sightings along the route where the tarp was found. It wasn't about catching someone on camera, it was about placing a purchase in time and then asking where that tape went. One store answered with specifics: a quantity of heavy-duty duct tape sold the morning following the last confirmed routine. The receipt showed additional items consistent with binding and packaging. Detectives didn't announce a breakthrough. They asked for the register number, the clerk's name, and any still archived surveillance for that lane. Even grainy footage can confirm gender, height range, and whether one or two people stood there. If the buyer later claimed they never handled tape, you want a counter built from receipts, not from memory. A second retail line developed that same week. Sales records pointed to a purchase of a bladed tool during business hours on the day the timeline went dark. That alone didn't mean harm. People buy tools. The question is whether that tool later surfaces in a home linked to the same social circle and whether anyone can credibly explain why it was acquired that day. Detectives documented the model, the store location, and the timing down to the minute. They didn't need to dramatize it. A clean chain from register to residence is drama enough. While the paper trail grew, the lab issued a separate memo: confirmatory testing on bloodstains consistent with the victim's profile from the apartment scene and from garments in the tarp. There was no body, but the biology was converging. The team updated the case board with straight lines instead of theories: apartment blood, rural tarp, hair on tape, receipts for tape and a blade, an intersecting adult within the victim's orbit. The map was simple on purpose. In a no-body case, complexity is where doubt hides. Interviews changed tenor without changing tone. Investigators recontacted people who had already spoken once and kept questions clean: where were you between this hour and that hour? Who can confirm it? Have you bought these items recently? Can we see the garage, the trunk, the closet? When answers drifted, they didn't argue, they stacked. A statement that seemed harmless alone, "I was home all morning," looks different next to a time-stamped receipt 3 miles away. That isn't trickery. That's how time, money, and movement tell the truth when people won't. There's a human piece worth saying out loud. Families want names. Viewers want a reveal. Investigators don't jump it. The goal isn't to accuse in public and fix the story later, it's to build a file that doesn't break in court. In towns like this, respect looks like patience, letting labs finish, letting records arrive, and only then moving a person from contact to suspect. It's not indifference. It's how you avoid losing a just case on a technicality. By the end of that cycle, the case had something it didn't have before: a bridge from item to person. The hair tied the tape to a specific individual connected to the victim's life. The purchase records tied materials and a tool to a narrow window. None of it proved where Girly was taken or how she was killed. But the distance between the apartment and the rural pull-off shrank. You could now ask specific questions with documentary weight: who had the tape, who had the tool, and who spent time with the missing woman in the hours before her routine stopped. Tomorrow's work was set before anyone went home. Warrants were drafted for a residence and a vehicle associated with the woman linked by DNA. A separate request sought full loyalty card histories for tape and tool purchases across neighboring stores during the same period, in case a second buyer tried to mirror the first. If you're building a nobody homicide, redundancy isn't waste, it's insurance that a jury will see the same picture from multiple angles. For anyone watching who's lived this kind of uncertainty, progress often looks like paperwork until it doesn't. A name attached to a hair isn't closure, but it's a step that leads to doors, closets, and trunks you can lawfully open. That's how missing becomes solved, even when a body is never found. The warrants landed before sunrise. Teams split, one for the residents tied to the DNA match from the duct tape, another for a vehicle registered at the same address. Entry was calm, documented, and narrow in scope: packaging supplies, cutting tools, outerwear, and anything that could account for a tarp wrapped around Girly Chew Hassenkoff's clothing. In no body cases, you don't hope for a confession, you look for ordinary items that tell an unforgiving story. The residents' search moved room by room. Investigators photographed storage shelves and pulled only what the warrant allowed: a roll of heavy-duty tape with a torn end, a utility blade with recent wear, and a receipt booklet that shouldn't have been there but was. In the attic, a bladed tool consistent with the retail model flagged in purchase records rested in a cardboard sleeve. It was logged, swabbed, and bagged. Nothing was said at the door. If a tool appears after a documented purchase in the critical window, that's a question only evidence should ask. Outside, the vehicle search followed the same rules. Trunk liner fibers were lifted with tape pulls. A spare tire well was checked for staining and debris. A simple paper grocery bag in the back held a few lengths of torn tape with dust clinging to the adhesive. Those strips were sealed as found, then separated in the lab to protect whatever trace survived. You don't narrate intent, you preserve surfaces. If comparisons later show the torn edges line up with the roll from the residence, that's not drama, it's alignment. Interviews restarted that afternoon. The woman linked by DNA was invited to speak with counsel. The tone stayed neutral and procedural. Investigators used the receipts like mile markers. At this time, at this location, a purchase was made. Can you account for that? The answer was a short denial. Timing, the subject said, was wrong. She had been home. A second topic, ownership of a bladed tool, drew a similar line. It wasn't hers, it had always been there, or she couldn't remember buying it. The room didn't argue. The room compared. When a timestamp meets and I was home, one of them is wrong. 2 additional interviews filled in the picture. A retail clerk remembered the bladed tool sale because the buyer asked a specific question about returns. Store policy didn't allow them on open packaging. The clerk's recollection matched what the register log already showed. Another witness, a neighbor in the same complex as the DNA-linked residence, remembered seeing a car back into the driveway the night the timeline went dark and again near dawn. Small details become anchors when they repeat across independent sources. The lab kept pace. Tape tears from the residence and from the grocery bag in the vehicle were photographed under magnification. Edges can fit together like a broken seal. When they do, they date the use of a roll more precisely than any opinion. Early results suggested a possible match between one torn end found in the vehicle and the roll recovered from inside. Confirmatory imaging was cued. On the biology side, limited trace on the utility blade was too degraded to profile immediately, but analysts reserved it for later testing if workflow allowed. The point wasn't to stretch a tiny result, it was to bank what might matter when the rest of the file is complete. Detectives also pushed the loyalty card angle. If someone bought tape and a tool at one store, they might have bought related supplies at another. That week, 2 neighboring retailers responded with data pulls that widened the purchase window by a day and added cleaning products to the list. Again, none of this proved where Girly was taken. It established means and preparation within a short time frame. When jurors later weigh a no-body prosecution, they look for patterns that show planning, not accident. There's a human side to this part of the work, and it's measured. You keep families informed without tipping strategy. We explained that the case had moved from broad interviews to focused checks against receipts and that search warrants produced items now under examination. We didn't name the person tied by DNA on camera, and we didn't speculate about outcomes. Respect in this line of work means protecting the case and the people at the same time. Before the day ended, detectives ran one last alignment on a whiteboard: apartment blood consistent with the victim, clothing and tape from a rural pull-off, DNA hair tying the tape to a woman in the victim's circle, receipts for tape and a bladed tool in the critical window, a matching tool in the attic, and tape segments recovered from a car. Each step had a document or a label next to it. There was still no body and no admission. But the file had grown from assumptions to tangible bridges, home to car to rural site, with fewer places to hide. If you're watching and wondering why it still feels slow, that's fair. This is the place where some cases go off the rails, officers talk too much, accuse too soon, or lean on theories that don't stand up later. We won't do that here. The next move is measured, finish the tear match analysis, route remaining items for confirmatory testing, and bring the subject back for a second interview with counsel present, this time confronting the denials with documents. In small communities, justice isn't a reveal at minute 40, it's the moment the pieces fit the same way no matter who assembles them. By now the file had weight. What it needed was a clean threshold, evidence that didn't just suggest proximity but supported charges. That came in 3 moves that lined up without help from anyone's opinion. First, the lab finalized the torn edge comparison. One strip of duct tape lifted from the vehicle fit the roll seized at the residence like a snapped seal put back together. The photographs weren't dramatic, they were exact. Edges, fibers, and microscopic stress lines paired in a way a jury could see. This didn't prove where Girly Chew was taken. It proved the same roll that lived in that house supplied tape found in that car during the critical window. In no body cases, that kind of continuity matters more than any speech. Second, the receipts grew teeth. The tape and bladed tool purchases already sat on the board, but loyalty card returns from 2 retailers added timing and frequency. The same household account showed clustered buys of tape, plastic sheeting, and a strong cleaner within 48 hours of the timeline break. None of those items are illegal. Together, and tied to the other evidence sites, they read like preparation and cleanup. Detectives didn't dramatize it. They walked the documents to the prosecutor's office and matched each line to a minute on the timeline. Third, statements began to collapse under the records. The woman whose DNA was on the tape returned for a second interview with counsel present. The questions stayed narrow and verifiable: location at a specific hour, whether she possessed the roll later matched to the vehicle tape, whether she bought the tool now logged from her attic. The answers were short and inconsistent with receipts and loyalty data. A neighbor's sighting of the backed-in car, once a soft note, became a firm pin when the timestamp matched the retail runs. Detectives didn't push beyond that. You don't need a confession when time and money talk. With those 3 pillars, tear match confirmed, clustered purchases on a single account, and statements that failed against documents, the case met charging standards. The district attorney authorized arrest and search warrants that went beyond packaging supplies, digital devices, address books, and any records of travel or burial equipment. In a no-body prosecution, you widen for movement, where someone could have driven in the hours after the apartment went dark and the car stayed put. Investigators requested cell records for associates in the same circle, not to fish but to lock down who pinged where during the window that mattered. Serving the warrants looked like the earlier searches: quiet, recorded, and focused. One device contained a recent deletion pattern around the dates of the purchases. It wasn't proof of content, but it justified a forensic extraction order. In the garage, a section of nylon cord matched a partial length recovered with the rural tarp bundle. The weave and dye were consistent, and samples went straight to the lab. In a storage bin, a receipt book included a handwritten note with a date that overlapped the loyalty purchases. None of these items solved the case alone. Together they narrowed opportunity to almost nothing. When the arrest was made, the public statement stayed disciplined. An adult female remained missing. Evidence supported charges related to her disappearance. The investigation continued. That restraint matters. Families want names and finality. Investigators owe them a conviction that will hold. In small communities, you honor both by speaking only to what can be proved. For anyone listening who has waded through a case like this, here's the human truth: charges are not the end. They are the moment a case stops being a rumor and becomes a record. From here, evidence is tested again under rules neither side controls. That's not delay, it's how the system protects the verdict you want. Charges changed the posture, but they didn't change the standard. The file still had to prove what happened to Girly Chew without a recovered body. So the work shifted to two lanes that juries understand, what the devices show and what the roads show. Digital forensics came back in plain language. One seized phone and one home computer both showed manual deletions in the 48 hours after Girly failed to report to work. That, by itself, is nothing special. People delete things. What mattered were the artifacts left behind, recently cleared web history tied to cleaning supplies and packaging materials already documented in retail records, and a cluster of map app lookups for rural pull-offs south of Albuquerque. Analysts didn't guess at motive. They printed timestamps and recovered file fragments that placed those lookups squarely inside the timeline investigators had already locked. Location data added a second layer. The phone didn't run sophisticated app tracking in 1999, but later backups captured tower associations from that era when the device was migrated. Engineers extracted a coarse breadcrumb, evening and pre-dawn hits that favored the corridor where the tarp was found. It wasn't GPS. It didn't have to be. When a device history favors the same stretch of road the receipts and witness sightings already point to, it narrows options the way a fence narrows a pasture. On the vehicle side, the odometer told a simple story. Service records from before the disappearance pinned a baseline. A measurement taken during the search and compared against routine weekly mileage showed an outlier, a distance consistent with a round trip toward the same rural zone in the small hours after Girly's last confirmed contact. Gas receipts were thin, cash purchases leave shallow tracks, but one local station kept pump controller logs with timestamps. Investigators matched the purchase window there to the same night. It wasn't a license plate capture. It was a clock, a pump number, and a known habit, refueling before long drives. The cord recovered in the garage tested out as consistent in weave and dye with the cut piece bundled with the tarp. The lab report didn't overstate it. It said consistent, not same. Jurors hear the difference. Prosecutors prefer that honesty because it survives cross-examination. The same went for the tape tear match. The comparison images were printed side by side, labeled, and placed on a demonstrative board that any layperson could follow in 3 steps. Interviews tightened around those points. A second neighbor, asked only about sounds and schedules, recalled a garage door cycling at an odd hour the night the phone records first went quiet. Retail clerks who had already identified timing on tape and tool purchases were asked to confirm whether company policy required loyalty entry for cleaning products bought the next day. Their answers matched the logs. No single witness carried the case. Each confirmation made the paper straighter. We kept the family in the loop without promising what the evidence couldn't deliver. No one said a recovery was close. We said the case now moved on a track that courts recognize: devices, roads, receipts, and material matches, all inside a narrow, documented window. In communities like Albuquerque, that kind of clarity is what gives families a verdict they can live with even when they don't get the return they prayed for. The prosecution team started drafting the opening structure around those anchors. Motive would not lead, the record would. Opportunity would be shown by the timeline and the car. Means would be shown by the purchases, the tools, the cord, and the tape continuity. And the absence of financial or workplace activity from Girly after the break would close the loop. She did not walk away. She could not have sustained herself unseen. The law allows juries to draw that conclusion when the physical record leaves no other reasonable path. The state kept it plain. No speeches about character, just the record, step by step, exactly how the case was built. Jurors first saw the apartment documented as a violent scene tied to Girly Chew. Then the rural pull-off, a tarp bundle with her clothing and duct tape that trapped a hair from a woman in her circle. Each exhibit arrived with a chain of custody and a timestamp. Nothing relied on anyone's memory. Retail managers authenticated receipts and loyalty logs for heavy-duty tape, plastic sheeting, a cutting tool, and cleaning agents inside the narrow window when Girly's routine stopped. A lab photographer walked through side-by-side images showing a torn strip from a seized vehicle lining up with a roll taken from a linked residence, the broken seal fit that juries can see without technical jargon. Movement evidence followed, an overnight mileage outlier consistent with a round trip toward the tarp corridor, a pump time window at a nearby station, and neighbors noting a backed-in car and a garage door cycling at odd hours. Digital examiners added recovered artifacts, deletions in the 2 days after the no-show at work, searches for packaging and cleaning supplies, and map lookups to rural pull-offs south of Albuquerque. None of these pieces had to agree, they simply did. The defense pressed predictable gaps, transfer possibilities, the word consistent in the court report, the absence of GPS, and, most of all, the absence of a body. The state returned to convergence. People with stable jobs do not vanish while their blood is found at home, their finances go silent, their clothing appears in a tarp off a highway, and their associates by the very materials that bridge house, car, and roadside. The law in New Mexico does not require a recovered body when the physical record leaves no reasonable path out. Verdicts followed the paper. Linda Henning was convicted on the counts tried before the court and received a lengthy sentence. In a parallel track resolved in 2002, Diazian Hasenkopf entered a guilty plea and was sentenced to life in prison. Through post-conviction litigation and the years since, one fact remains: as of October 31, 2025, Girly Chew Hasenkopf has not been found. There is a humane point worth saying once, and only once: a careful file is a form of respect. It honors a victim who cannot testify, gives a community answers it can trust, and protects a verdict from collapsing under scrutiny. This case reached the truth the only way a nobody case can, by letting receipts, images, clocks, and simple miles tell it. I tell these cases to honor Girly and to remind us what saves lives: trust your gut, report early, document patterns, and check on one another. Justice here came from receipts, minutes, and neighbors who spoke up, proof that ordinary people can hold the line. What detail hit you hardest? What should change in how we respond to the missing? Share your thoughts, and where you're watching from. If this story moved you, or didn't, tell me why below. And if you want real, fact-driven cases told with respect, please subscribe to see crime stories for the next investigation.